Tasha Williams sat in the waiting room, her fingers nervously tapping against the folder in her lap. It was the kind of day she had hoped wouldn't come, a minor court appearance that felt more like a formality than anything else. Still, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety. She had heard enough stories of how quickly things could go awry in a courtroom, and today was no exception. Her case was simple, a fine for an overdue payment on a minor violation that had gotten tangled up in the system. Tasha had tried to pay it, but a combination of logistical errors and her overwhelming student loan debt made it impossible to settle everything on time. It wasn't that she was trying to avoid her responsibilities. Far from it. She had just found herself drowning in a sea of bills, loans, and financial instability that many people in her shoes understood all too well. As she walked into the courtroom, she adjusted the collar of her jacket and straightened her posture. The judge, an older white man named Markley, barely looked up from his papers when she was called to the stand. He seemed distracted, as if her case was just another in a long list of similar infractions he had seen 100 times before. He glanced at her, then back at the file, clearly unimpressed by her presence. "Tasha Williams," Judge Markley said, his voice a bit more curt than necessary. "I see you've missed several payment deadlines. Do you have an explanation?" Tasha cleared her throat, trying to steady her voice. "Yes, Your Honor. I've been trying to manage my finances, but I've been struggling to make ends meet due to my student loan payments. I'm doing my best, but it's been difficult to stay on top of everything." The judge barely looked at her as she spoke. He flipped through the paperwork and muttered, "That's not really my concern. The rules are clear." Tasha's heart sank. She had hoped the judge would show some understanding, especially since she wasn't asking for any special treatment, just a bit of leniency. But instead, he seemed more interested in sticking to procedure than hearing her story. "I'm afraid you'll need to pay the fine," Judge Markley said, his voice resolute. "I'll also recommend you be put on a payment plan to ensure this doesn't happen again." Tasha nodded, biting back the frustration that was rising in her chest. She had hoped for a different outcome, but this wasn't the time to argue. She was just one more person caught in a system that didn't always see the bigger picture, the people behind the paperwork, the stories of struggle and perseverance. As she left the courtroom, the weight of the fine felt heavy. But deeper still was the feeling that something had to change. It was a small setback, yes, but it sparked something bigger inside her. A determination that would drive her to challenge the very systems that, like today, made life harder for people like her. Tasha walked out of the courthouse, her mind a whirlwind of frustration. The fine, though not catastrophic, was just another symbol of the systemic struggles that had defined much of her life. As she stepped into the bright afternoon sun, she exhaled deeply, pushing aside the bitterness that threatened to consume her. This wasn't the time to wallow in defeat. She had bigger battles to fight, ones that could potentially change the lives of millions of people who were facing the same crushing weight of student loan debt. Tasha had never been one to back down from a challenge. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, she had learned early on that nothing came easily. She had worked hard to get into a respected university, earning her degree with a mixture of scholarships, loans, and determination. But now, nearly a decade later, the debt seemed endless. Each payment was a reminder of the financial burden she carried, a burden that prevented her from fully pursuing her dreams, building a future, and giving back to the community that had shaped her. It wasn't just her own situation that fueled her fire. Tasha knew that millions of Americans were facing similar challenges. The student loan system, with its outdated structures and punitive policies, was holding people back from reaching their full potential. Tasha wasn't just an advocate for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been buried under the weight of loans, whose lives were defined by numbers on a spreadsheet rather than their potential. Despite her own financial struggles, Tasha had found a way to make a difference. She was part of a coalition of activists and policy experts dedicated to overhauling the federal student loan system. The group had been quietly working behind the scenes, drafting proposals to create a more equitable system, one that would reduce the debt burden for millions of Americans. They were pushing for reforms that would eliminate interest accrual during periods of financial hardship, provide income-based repayment options, and establish clearer pathways to forgiveness for borrowers. Tasha was a key voice in this movement, and although her efforts had mostly been behind closed doors, the impact was starting to be felt. Her name was becoming known among lawmakers, advocates, and even some financial institutions. Still, there was so much work left to do. Every day felt like a race against time as she balanced her own job, the student loan battle, and personal challenges. But despite the exhaustion, Tasha couldn't ignore the growing sense that this was her calling, that her pain, her struggles, could be the fuel for real change. As she boarded the bus home, her mind was already turning. She would take that fine, that frustrating moment in the courtroom, and channel it into something much larger. The system had underestimated her before, but Tasha Williams wasn't the kind of woman who would be silenced by an obstacle. If anything, it only made her more determined to keep fighting. And she knew that soon she'd have the power to make the world listen. Tasha spent the following weeks grappling with the court's decision. The fine wasn't the financial burden, though it certainly wasn't helpful, but the feeling of being judged by someone who hadn't taken the time to understand her situation. It stung. She couldn't shake the frustration that the system seemed built to keep people like her down. Still, she pushed through it. There was no time for self-pity. She had a much larger mission at hand. In the evenings after work, Tasha would return to her tiny apartment, the walls lined with piles of research papers and reports on student loan debt. She was up late most nights, typing away at her computer or making calls to coalition members, brainstorming ways to move their proposal forward. It was exhausting work, but Tasha thrived in it. Every moment of her day, from the tedious paperwork to the late-night strategizing, fueled her determination to make the system better for everyone who had been overlooked. But she knew that the fight would require more than just policy proposals. It would require public awareness. Her face wasn't widely known outside of the circles working on student loan reform, but she was confident that if more people understood what was at stake, they would rally behind the cause. Tasha had always been a private person, but she was beginning to realize that her voice could be a powerful tool. The court fine, though a minor inconvenience, became a reminder that people often overlooked the challenges that many in her community faced daily. It was a feeling she could no longer ignore. One day, as she sat in her cramped apartment, scrolling through emails, she saw a new notification that made her heart skip. It was an invitation to speak at a national conference on education reform. The invitation had come from one of the key lawmakers working with the coalition, someone she had been in touch with, but never imagined would personally invite her to speak. The event would bring together activists, policymakers, and leaders in the education sector. This was a chance to be heard on a much larger stage. The invitation was a huge step forward, and it gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just speaking about student loan debt anymore. She was now going to present a solution. Tasha worked tirelessly for the next few weeks, crafting her speech with precision. She knew this moment could change everything for her and for the countless others who had suffered under the weight of their loans. As she stood before the mirror the night before the conference, rehearsing her lines, she realized something. The courtroom fine, though painful, had pushed her to reach even higher. This was her time, not just to be heard, but to ignite a movement. What started as a small setback was transforming into the spark she needed to fuel her bigger dream. Judge Markley hadn't thought much about the woman he fined. It was just another day in the courtroom, another minor infraction, another case to check off his list. He had dismissed Tasha's explanation, viewing it as nothing more than a common excuse. Yet something about her stuck with him. As he sat in his chambers that evening, the face of the young woman who had appeared before him lingered in his mind. It wasn't her appearance, or even the fine she received, that bothered him. It was the feeling that he had missed something. When Tasha spoke, there was a quiet resolve in her voice. It wasn't the usual tone of someone looking for sympathy. It was the voice of someone who had been fighting for far too long and wasn't ready to give up. Judge Markley had heard countless similar stories in his career. People facing financial hardships, tangled in debt, struggling to stay afloat. But there was something different about Tasha. Maybe it was the stark contrast between the courtroom, where the law was clear-cut and impersonal, and her life outside of it, where every decision seemed to carry weight beyond its immediate consequence. She wasn't asking for leniency. She was simply asking to be understood. That night, as he flipped through papers on his desk, Judge Markley came across an article that mentioned Tasha's name again. This time, the context was different. It wasn't about a minor violation or an overdue payment. It was about student loan reform, and the young woman was now making headlines. According to the article, Tasha Williams had become one of the most prominent voices in a growing movement to address the student loan crisis that was burdening millions of Americans. She was part of a coalition that had gained traction with lawmakers, pushing for policies that would ease the burden of debt and create a path to meaningful forgiveness. Intrigued, the judge read more. Tasha wasn't just advocating for minor changes to the system. She was demanding a total overhaul. Her proposal focused on the idea that the student loan system, as it stood, disproportionately affected low-income families, forcing them into lifelong debt with little to no opportunity for relief. It was a bold vision, and one that had already started gaining political support. Judge Markley found himself captivated by her story. He had assumed, based on the brief interaction in his courtroom, that Tasha was just another borrower struggling to make ends meet. But he realized that he had underestimated her. She wasn't just a victim of the system. She was actively working to change it. And that realization made him uncomfortable. He had always thought of himself as someone who followed the law to the letter. But now, he couldn't help but wonder if, in doing so, he had missed something bigger. The next day, Judge Markley found himself searching for more information about Tasha Williams. What he didn't know was that this quiet curiosity was the beginning of a shift in his perspective, a shift that would soon lead to an unexpected connection between them. Tasha stood at the podium, her heart racing as she gazed out at the sea of faces in the crowded auditorium. The National Conference on Education Reform was one of the biggest events in the field, and her invitation to speak was a significant milestone in her journey. For years, she had been working behind the scenes, drafting policy proposals, meeting with lawmakers, and advocating for student loan reforms. But this was her moment to step into the spotlight. The room was filled with experts, activists, educators, and lawmakers, all gathered to discuss the future of education in America. But for Tasha, this wasn't just another discussion. It was the culmination of years of struggle, hard work, and a deep commitment to making a difference. She was no longer just one voice among many. She was becoming the voice of a movement that was gaining momentum with every passing day. She began her speech by talking about her own experience with student loan debt. She spoke with raw honesty about the challenges she had faced, how the burden of debt had kept her from pursuing her dreams, from starting a family, and from truly thriving. But she didn't stop there. She spoke about the millions of others who shared her experience, people who were stuck in the same cycle of debt and financial hardship, unable to escape a system that seemed designed to keep them down. Her words resonated deeply with the audience. She didn't just talk about statistics or abstract policy proposals. She told a story that people could relate to. And it wasn't just her story. It was the story of millions of Americans whose lives had been shaped by the weight of student loans. She called for bold, sweeping reforms, policies that would make student loans more manageable, that would provide clear paths to forgiveness, and that would offer relief to those who had been saddled with debt for far too long. As she spoke, the room grew quieter, more attentive. Tasha could feel the energy in the room shifting. She wasn't just advocating for change anymore. She was inspiring it. After her speech, she was swarmed by reporters, lawmakers, and activists eager to connect with her, to learn more about her vision and how they could help push it forward. She had become a national figure overnight. But despite the excitement, Tasha knew that the real work was just beginning. She had captured the attention of the right people, but now she needed to turn that attention into tangible action. Her coalition's proposals were gaining support, but there was still resistance. The powers that be were reluctant to change a system that had been in place for decades. Yet, Tasha remained undeterred. She knew that this was her chance to make history, to create a future where the dream of higher education was accessible without the burden of lifelong debt. And as she stood in the buzzing hall after her speech, Tasha felt a renewed sense of purpose. The movement was no longer just her own. It was a force that was growing stronger every day. And she was at the heart of it. Judge Markley sat at his desk late into the evening, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across his cluttered paperwork. The pile of cases before him seemed endless, but his mind kept drifting back to Tasha Williams. He had never met anyone quite like her. The more he read about her and her work, the more his initial dismissive impression of her had begun to change. He had spent years following the law, believing that its fairness lay in its strict application. To him, people who didn't pay their debts, whether it was a missed payment or an overdue fine, were simply ignoring the rules. He had believed that the law offered equal treatment to all, and that anyone could succeed if they followed the path set before them. But as Tasha's story unfolded in the articles and interviews he read, he began to question that conviction. The more he learned about the student loan crisis, the more he realized that the system itself was flawed, deeply flawed. Tasha had been one of the countless individuals burdened by a system that seemed designed to trap people in debt. But what made Tasha different wasn't just her struggle. It was her ability to turn that struggle into a movement for systemic change. Tasha wasn't just trying to get out of debt. She was determined to fix the system that had caused it in the first place. Judge Markley found himself drawn into the details of her reform proposals. Her coalition was advocating for changes that would provide more lenient repayment options, a better framework for student loan forgiveness, and protections for low-income borrowers. He couldn't help but think that, had he known more about these issues when Tasha had appeared in his courtroom, he might have approached her case differently. Perhaps instead of imposing a fine, he could have seen her as part of a larger narrative. A story of systemic injustice, one that was bigger than a single missed payment. He began to wonder if his role in the legal system was, in some way, complicit in perpetuating that injustice. As a judge, he enforced the rules, but he had never questioned whether those rules were fair. Was it right to impose harsh penalties on individuals like Tasha, who were already struggling with the weight of a broken system? Was his job only to uphold the law, or did he have a responsibility to ensure that the law worked for everyone, not just the ones who could afford to follow it? The more he reflected, the more he realized that his perspective had been narrow. He had seen his job as a simple application of rules. But now he saw it as part of a larger social contract. And suddenly, he wasn't so sure that the system was as fair as he had once believed. A few days later, Judge Markley made a decision that would change everything. He reached out to Tasha Williams, hoping to have a conversation with her, not just as a judge, but as someone who was genuinely interested in understanding her perspective. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of an unexpected journey that would challenge everything he had known about justice, law, and his own role within it. Tasha's phone buzzed as she sat at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee. It was an unfamiliar number, but the message was clear. Judge Markley would like to speak with you regarding your case and some recent developments in student loan policy. She stared at the screen, puzzled. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, let alone for him to reach out on his own initiative. The judge who had fined her just weeks ago was now requesting a conversation. After a moment's hesitation, Tasha decided to call back. She couldn't help but wonder what had prompted this sudden shift in attitude. Was it her recent success in the media? Or perhaps something more profound, an actual change of heart? When the call connected, Judge Markley's voice was calm but sincere. "Ms. Williams, I've been reading up on your work, and I wanted to reach out. I think there's more to your story than I realized. I'd like to hear your perspective, if you're willing to share it." Tasha listened carefully, taken aback by the humility in his tone. This wasn't the same judge who had dismissed her case months ago. This was someone genuinely interested in understanding her, not just as a defendant in his courtroom, but as an advocate for an entire community. "I'm glad you reached out," she said, her voice steady. "I've been trying to make a difference with the student loan system, but it's been hard. There's a lot at stake here, and the changes we need aren't easy to make. The system is built in a way that traps people, and we're just trying to give them a way out." Markley paused, clearly processing her words. "I've been doing some thinking about my role as a judge," he admitted. "I've always believed that the law was black and white. But the more I learn, the more I realize that there are gray areas that need attention. Your work has made me question the fairness of the system I'm helping to enforce. I want to understand more. Maybe there's a way I can help." Tasha was stunned. It wasn't often that someone in a position of authority acknowledged the flaws of the system in such a candid way. The fact that Judge Markley, someone who had been part of that very system, was willing to open his mind to the possibility of change was nothing short of remarkable. They spent the next hour discussing the student loan crisis and the reforms Tasha and her coalition were advocating for. Markley listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions, his perspective shifting with every point she made. By the end of the conversation, Tasha felt a sense of connection she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just a judge reaching out to her. It was someone who was ready to be an ally in the fight for justice. As they said their goodbyes, Tasha felt a renewed sense of hope. Perhaps the system could change, not just from the outside, but from within. And with unlikely allies like Judge Markley, they might just have a chance to break through the walls that had held so many back for so long. In the weeks following her conversation with Judge Markley, Tasha began to see signs that things were shifting. The judge had not only become more involved in the conversation about student loan reform, but he was also starting to use his position to advocate for change. He joined her coalition's efforts, lending his credibility and legal expertise to their cause. His influence within the judicial system and the community gave their movement a legitimacy it hadn't had before. Tasha couldn't have predicted how quickly things would evolve. Judge Markley had introduced her to key policymakers, many of whom had been skeptical of the reforms at first, but were now listening more intently. His involvement made a significant difference in the way her proposals were viewed. What had once been dismissed as radical ideas were now being seriously considered by those in power. It was a breakthrough moment, but Tasha knew it was just the beginning. As the coalition's policy proposals gained traction, the media coverage grew. Tasha was invited to speak on national television, and her story became a rallying cry for those who had been struggling with student loan debt for years. Her message was simple yet powerful. The system needed to be reformed to reflect the realities of borrowers' lives. She spoke about the brokenness of the system, how it disproportionately affected low-income and minority communities, and how it kept people from achieving their full potential. She wasn't just advocating for financial relief. She was fighting for a society where education was a tool for empowerment, not a lifelong burden. Judge Markley's role in all of this became public, and his support added a layer of credibility to their campaign. His shift from skeptic to advocate was symbolic of the broader shift that was happening within the justice system. He had started questioning the very foundation of the student loan system, and his change of heart helped inspire others to do the same. Tasha knew the battle wasn't over. The road to reform was long and fraught with opposition, but now she felt a sense of momentum that had been absent before. She no longer felt like a lone voice in the wilderness. With Judge Markley by her side and a growing coalition of advocates and allies, she was part of something much larger, something that could create real change. One day, as she sat at her desk, reviewing the latest proposal, Tasha received a message from the judge. It was a simple note, but the words made her smile. "We're in this together." As she read the message, Tasha realized that the courtroom clash that had once seemed like an obstacle had now become the catalyst for something extraordinary. The judge who had fined her was now her ally. And together, they were changing the course of history. One policy, one conversation, one act of courage at a time.